I chose journalism to be close to people. It might not be easy to change the reality, but at least I could bring their voice to the world. I am Shireen Abu Aql. I would like to start this session with a moment of silence in remembrance of Shireen Abu Aql. May her soul rest in eternal peace and power. Good afternoon. My name is Karma Ekmekji, and I'm a senior policy fellow at the Isssam Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, where I lead on the Women, Peace and Security program. It is wonderful to have you all here with us today for this workshop to introduce to you the Women, Peace and Security agenda and talk about, together, how we can work together to mainstream this agenda in the Arab media. This workshop is organized by the Isssam Institute in collaboration with Media Lab and with the generous support of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We would like to thank you. We have Dilek here with us from FES Lebanon, and we are very proud of this partnership because FES really attributes great importance to the role of gender in media and the Women, Peace and Security agenda as a whole. So we thank you for your generous support. I'm going to start today's presentation, and I want you to keep in mind that today we're talking about the Women, Peace and Security agenda in a very general way to introduce you to this topic. This actually is a topic that I teach here in this university for a whole semester, and sometimes even when the semester finishes, I feel like there are so many issues we haven't covered yet. But we're going to do our best today and tomorrow to have a deep dive with you on this agenda, and I will be giving a quick introduction. But let's start with a quick video.
Today's wars are more complex than those of the past. The diversity of actors makes conventional two-party peace negotiations unrealistic. We need a paradigm shift, from seeing peacemaking as a military political process of power sharing to a societal process of responsibility sharing, from limiting negotiations to armed actors to inviting peace actors, especially women peace builders. Because when women in civil society are included, peace is 54% more likely to be sustainable. The UN came on board with new policies in 2000, but neither the UN nor many governments have changed practices enough. Because warring parties don't want women present, they say that the exclusion of women is cultural and that military and security issues are technical and irrelevant to women peace builders. They question legitimacy and write them off as unqualified. Or they appoint women who toe the party line and distance themselves from the women on the ground. And mediators are afraid to rock the boat. But women's exclusion from peace talks isn't cultural. If it were, it'd look different from one country to the next. It's the same everywhere, because those at the table want to limit power for personal benefit rather than share responsibility for rebuilding society, and women peace builders challenge them to do so. Peace agreements shouldn't benefit one group over others. Good agreements set a blueprint for the future of an entire society. That's why inclusivity matters. If women and minorities aren't represented at the table, their future might be on the table. But we know how to ensure inclusion. Frame women's inclusion as a way to increase the warring party's legitimacy. Provide delegates with gendered briefings on the issues at hand, and set a quota. If no women are appointed, those seats remain empty. The Yemen National Dialogue Conference required 1/3 of delegates to be women, and South Africa required 1/2 of delegates. Rebuff the argument that women are unqualified by questioning the qualifications of the men at the table. Being violent shouldn't be the only ticket to the talks. Suggest criteria for including women in civil society based on their commitment to human rights and non-violence, and their expertise in diverse services and sectors, like mediating, disarming fighters, reconciliation and relief provision. Convene women across party lines to develop shared priorities and safeguard rights. Mandate the envoy to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Include women from the start and invite them to address international meetings, and appoint an experienced gender advisor early on. The mediator can set up an advisory group of women civil society experts to advise him or her. There's plenty of precedents to build on and improve. Women know a lot about local security issues, such as landmined areas and threats to civilians. Some women are armed fighters themselves. Women can be valuable assets and help monitor ceasefires, build confidence, and reduce sexual violence. Women's groups protect and provide for their communities. Women and civil society humanize the effects of war and the violence perpetrated by both sides. We can't end war without the warring parties. We can't make lasting peace without peaceful actors. Both are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient.
Around 22 years ago, after a lot of work that was conducted by actors in civil society, policy, public policy, and gender experts, the world came together to finally unanimously pass a Security Council resolution, a landmark resolution on women, peace, and security. Because, what seems to be obvious to many of us, this issue was not on the radar. Women were not considered, or actually it wasn't articulated officially, that they play an integral role, an integral part in peace and security, an indispensable part in peace and security. So they came together and passed a Security Council resolution, which was 1325, which actually kick-started the whole debate, or the whole effort on having more women in high-level decision-making positions, and sort of raising the awareness amongst all the nations across the world that it's time for women to take part in peace and security. Now, a few years before that, so this happened in the year 2000, a few years before that, there was something that I'm sure most of you have heard of in 1995 called the Beijing Conference, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. This is where the seeds were planted for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I don't know if you may have heard this in Arabic, Agenda al-Mar'a wal-Aman wal-Salam. It has become more and more prevalent in meetings and different conferences now on peace and security, but not enough. And this is why we are having this workshop today, and this is why you are all very, very, very important part of the puzzle of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So in Beijing, you know, which was the most visionary agenda for the empowerment of women, you had 189 governments that were there and taking strategic decisions. There were main themes, like I said, that planted the seeds for the Women, Peace and Security agenda: violence, armed conflict, the girl and child, power and decision-making, and institutional mechanisms. We then, like I said, get to the Security Council resolution, which basically addressed prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, mufawadat al-salam, peacekeeping, which is a very particular aspect of the peace and security agenda. So it's a UN-driven mission, which is, for instance, here in Lebanon, we have a big peacekeeping mission called UNIFIL, and there are many others across the world, so that's peacekeeping, post-conflict reconstruction, peace building, and humanitarian response. And this resolution has 4 pillars. And it's very important for me that you keep these 4 pillars in mind. If you forget everything else I said today, keep in mind these 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery. I tell you to keep these 4 pillars in mind because as journalists, as reporters, as executives in the media industry, this is the sort of the lens through which reporting on the Women, Peace and Security agenda should be introduced in your work or mainstreamed in your work. Again, I'm trying to go over it very quickly, and then if at the end you have questions on more details, I'm more than happy to answer. So like I said, we started in 1995, and then in 2000 we had the resolution. And then we fast forwarded to 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG agenda, was introduced to the world. And it tied also with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, primarily through 3 goals. Goal number 5, gender equality. Goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And goal number 17, partnerships. These 3 milestones constituted the framework of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It provided for a structural way for us to approach this topic. Of course, goal number 5, which is the primary one, talks about ending discrimination against all women and girls, recognize and value unpaid care, eliminate violence against all women and girls, ensure women's participation, eliminate harmful practices, and universal access to reproductive health. So this is sort of the backdrop that I would ask you to keep in your minds when writing, reporting, producing anything from conflict-related zones. Because these elements are often forgotten. And this is why we wanted to draw your attention to this. Now, I want to tell you that throughout the past 100 years, conflict has shifted. So historically, 100 years ago, conflict had its major impact on the military. So you would have a big war, of course civilians would be killed, but mainly soldiers were the numbers counted in wars, in the World War I, in World War II, etc. And now, if we look at conflict, the civilians are the ones that are paying the brunt or carrying the brunt of the conflict. And among these civilians, it's the women. The women are the ones who are carrying the brunt of the conflict. So this is why we should shift our thinking and try to see things differently. Also, historically, when talking about conflicts, the actors of the conflict used to be governments or states. You would have states fighting each other. Over time, the conflict shifted, and non-state actors have also become prevalent in conflicts. You start having more civil wars, whereas before, the wars looked a little bit different. So again, here, there's a shift in the conflict. And a third dimension to how conflict has shifted is the space in which conflict is happening. Historically speaking, conflicts were, and still very much are, but often historically were in the physical space, in the kinetic space. Land, air, and sea defined conflicts. Today, that space has another partner, which is the digital space, or the cyberspace. There's cyber warfare happening. So now you have two different spaces where conflicts are happening. So all this background, meaning the shift of the conflict, the nature of the conflict, the victims of the conflict, where these conflicts are taking place, requires from us all to try to find solutions and address these conflicts in a different way. Because if we stick to the traditional way of doing things, we will fail. I can assure you, and we are. You all come from the Middle East. I know we have some colleagues who are coming from outside the Middle East. But the Middle East, according to the Global Peace Index, is the least peaceful region in the world. And so we all have to think together, and I'll tell you even more reason why in a bit, how to approach our conflicts and how to address our conflicts, and why we have to bring in different perspectives. And here I want you to keep in mind a concept, a notion, a very important, in my view, concept that you have to keep in your mind also as journalists: inclusivity. If we are not inclusive in the way we approach conflicts, I myself, I'm a mediator. And when I approach a conflict, I look now through an inclusive lens. You come from the media world, and I ask you to also apply an inclusive gender lens to be able to do your work to the best of your abilities. Now, because conflict shifted, so historically, two countries would fight, the presidents of the two countries meet at a meeting, shake hands, and find an agreement to end peace. But because all these different shifts are happening to the conflict, diplomacy has shifted as well. And diplomacy is no more limited to the traditional actors. Today, there are different actors that can play a role in diplomacy. This is why I would like to introduce to you multi-track diplomacy. And what multi-track diplomacy does is it utilizes all the levels of society in order to determine the needs and facilitate communication between all levels of society. And in this multi-track diplomacy, guess who has a very big role to play? The media. The media has a very big role to play. And here I would like to zoom in, like I said, to zoom in on your work, and of course I will leave my colleague Gretchen to do that. But I want you to know that your role in this new world of conflict has become so important. How you report the news, how you produce the news, how you bring in different experts to analyze current affairs has become so important, because you are the ones who have the ears of the people, and you are the ones who have the eyes of the people. And what you say matters. What you say can make or break. What you say can make a difference. It can really make a difference. And I would like you to start exercising your roles as members of this multi-track diplomacy. I love this graph. I use it all the time in all my presentations because it gives us an idea of the cycle of a conflict. And by understanding the graph, by understanding the cycle of a conflict, each one of us can understand where we can play a role in peace. Each one of us is an agent of peace. Not your leaders, not your MPs, they have their role to play too, but you are also agents of peace. You are also leaders in the community to bring peace. And this graph tells you the different points where you can plug yourselves in to be able to play a role in an existing conflict. My favorite space is this, prevention. Because I think that prevention is better than getting into a conflict. So when you start smelling that something is not right, things are not going well, you start exercising all the tools you have in your toolbox. Everything I can do in my power as a mediator, everything you can do in your power as media executives and journalists and reporters, everything we can to try to prevent a conflict. But sometimes conflict erupts. And then we are in the crisis, in the violent phase, and we have to manage this conflict. And again, here, how do we look at this period? What can we do to make sure that we are trying to address this crisis management? And at every point in time, women have a role to play. And it sometimes feels like women are used as accessories. Sometimes it feels like, yes, you know, it makes the picture look nicer. Let's get a woman. This is called tokenism. And we want to start moving away from this. Because what I want us to understand together here today is that women's role in conflict prevention, women's role in crisis management, women's role in peace building is what's going to define whether we're actually going to have peace or not. Studies have shown that civil wars that have erupted between 2011 and 2017, all the civil wars, were actually relapse wars, meaning they were wars that already existed, but they re-erupted. And one of the reasons these happened, according to the studies, is because women were never involved in the original peace agreement which was reached. And all the studies have shown that when women are part of the peace processes, when women are included, when women act as mediators, when they act as facilitators, the attained peace is more just, is more positive, and is more sustainable by an average of 15 years and longer. And so again, it's your role to highlight these facts. It's your role to tell the story. And I want to just end now, because my time is almost up, that yesterday, Dr. Lina Abirafa, who is the Executive Director of the Arab Institute for Women at this university, at the Lebanese American University, wrote an excellent piece on women reporting in war. We're going to share the link of this article in the PowerPoint presentation when it is sent to you, and I invite you all to read it, because it really gives you an idea of the important role that women are playing and should be playing in the peace and security of our nations. Thank you. I'm ready to answer any questions. إذا حدا عنده أي سؤال أنا هتفضل. Go ahead. Again, this was a very quick overview. There's a lot to say, but over the next 2 days we're going to, talk more about these matters. Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
we always focus on women, but nowadays we have other genders that we feel like we're discriminating them when we talk about women. What can we do about this? Because other people are feeling like we're not men, we're not women, we are some other gender. Yes. So these people also have rights. Another thing, why do we always focus on empowering women rather than teaching men or those who are treating women in the wrong way, or they are not giving women chances or opportunities? We need to teach those people rather than empowering women. Women are already strong enough to do their...
Absolutely. Can I answer her?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Keep in mind that I couldn't address everything in this. All right. So I'll start with the second and then I'll go to the first. The reason why we've called our program at the Isssam Faris Institute Democratizing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is because we came to the realization that this whole topic that I just explained to you for 10 minutes is very elitist. It's discussed in government positions, in multilateral institutions, in academic settings. But the average person on the street does not know what this agenda is about. Okay? I'll give you an example. 20 years ago, climate change was an elitist topic. 20 years ago, when I was doing my master's, a few policy advisors in government knew what climate change was about. A few scientists, were starting to talk more and more about it. Some governments were paying attention, but that's where it stopped. You fast forward 20 years, my son, who's 7, has a climate change project in school. So what has happened to this agenda? It has become mainstream. It has been democratized. He doesn't understand the chemical composition of the atmosphere that is leading the pollutant to add to the temperature of the earth. ما له فاهمين كل هذا الموضوع. But he knows that something is wrong in the planet and we need to address it. So, our aim is not to teach everyone about the 4 pillars of 1325 and what is 13. Our aim is to create partnerships and make people understand that unless all of society is included in peace processes, in negotiations, in peace building, in peacekeeping, in conflict prevention, رح نفوت كلنا سوا بالحيط. Already فايتين بالحيط. So, what you're saying is very true. For the past 25 years, since this agenda started, everyone has been working, and think of a mathematical equation, an economic equation, everyone has been working on the supply. Building capacity, empowering, etc., etc., etc. Everyone forgot the demand side of the equation. Okay, we have great women who are ready to take very important seats, but nobody's asking, demanding for this. And now the next 20 years, and here you all have a huge role to play, is to work on the demand side of the equation. How do we make people understand that we need to demand, and yes, this is the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is my area, but how do we demand all marginalized groups in society, and like I said, the golden word that I want you to get out of here and keep in your mind, inclusive, being inclusive, how can we demand that our leadership, that our government structures, our governance structures, our institutions, how are they inclusive? How can we make them inclusive? And unless my 7-year-old son has a school project about this, we're failing. We need to start talking about this early on. And you have the role, you have the power to start making this happen, right? So that's, for sure, we need to work on this demand side of the equation, which is what you, are talking about, and create alliances and partnerships. أنا ما بجي بقول يلا نحن we are better than the men. لا. We have to create partnerships. We need to find our allies. We need to find the he for she's. We need to find the people who are willing to work together to advance the society. In the question of other marginalized groups, I agree with you. And by the way, I'm speaking today about the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But if we really wanted to be very, if we had the time and the resources, there's the youth peace and security agenda. There's the queer peace and security agenda. And all are these every day. When you ask me the question, since you asked me the question, this agenda evolved because it's so fast-paced. Things are changing so fast in this space. And again, your role of keeping this, sometimes my husband has been in media for many years, and I tell him, why aren't people talking about this? He tells me the news is not sexy enough. Make it sexy enough. Khalas, we need to start making this on the news cycle. How do we make people want to hear about these issues? How do we make people hear about this and it's عادي? How do we make an interview about Yemen when we معنا على الدوبلكس ليه ما بنقول السيدة الأستاذة? We don't say this about Yemen conflict, about Syria conflict. It's always the same men looking straight in the eye, giving us the exact same analysis with the exact same perspective. So again, we have to go together, work together, and this is what we're going to do in the next 2 days, on how to help you be able to democratize this agenda. And of course, if you can take it further in the Arab world, please be my guest. Take it further to all marginalized groups. Yes? Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
It's on, just talk into it.
اوكي. شكرا على المحاضرة. بس بدي احكي شغلة، لما ذكرتي انه فكرة انه كيف المرأة بتكون قضية بس رمزية، هي من هذا المحل فكرة انه هو مقرب فكرة انه كيف المرأة هي قضية رمزية. من هذا المحل يمكن انا بقدر ابلش انه الفكرة مش بس قضية رمزية، انه لما نحكي عن غياب المشاركة الفاعل خلينا احكي، هي مش بس انها قضية رمزية، لا صارت ترند، انا اسفة على المصطلح، بس أنا نتعامل على إن قضايا المرأة مش عن جد كأنه في عندنا مشاكل لازم نتعامل معها، إنه في غياب فاعلية ومشاركة حقيقية لأنها عن جد غايبة لأنه في عندنا مشاكل. صار الموضوع عبارة عن ترند، إذا أحد مثلا بده يحكي عن الموضوع بس بحكي عن الموضوع عشان أحكي للناس إن أنا بحكي، بس الحكي لأجل الحكي بدون فعل. غياب الفعل هو اللي بيؤدي لغياب المشاركة اللي عن جد، واللي هي جاية من محل كمان أساسي اللي هي تناقضات النظام السياسي العالمي، اللي هو اصلا نظام خليني احكي نظام اصلا امبريالي، نظام ذكوري، نظام ذكوري بالضبط، نظام ذكوري، نظام سلطه ذكوري وموزع ذكوريته على الدول المحليه، يعني هو مش بس نظام عالمي ذكوري موزع هاي السلطه على كل المحلات، ولما يكون في اي مشاركه للنساء عشان بس تتوافق مع تناقضاته، انه تمام انا بقمع من جهه بس بنفس الوقت انا هنا عم اعطيكم شويه حريه، خلص اسكتوا ما تعملوا ولا اي شيء ثاني بكفي يخلف علينا اللي اعطيناكم، لانه هاي هي المشكله. لازم نبلش نغير كيف بننظر للمفاهيم عشان نحكي بكفي، لما نحكي بكفي بدنا نغير المفاهيم، لما نحكي انه بدنا مشاركه مش مشاركه عشان اجيب امراه بس احطها صح زي بس صوره، لا بدها تكون عن جد فاعله، بدنا نحكي لا بمعنى لا للفعل.
صح، شكرا على مداخله. صح ما في اوكي، انا هون بتفق معك، ويعني بدي اقول لك كمان انه الفكره اللي عم بتقوليه عن جد هذا كمان موضوع لازم ينشغل عليه بالاعلام، لانه نحن بحاجه لتغيير بالثقافه، وتغيير الثقافه بده جيل كامل تيحصل، ما حيحصل بكره الصبح. فقديش نحن بدنا نشتغل سوا انتم كاعلام ونحن يعني اشخاص براكتيشنرز نشتغل على الارض بهذا الموضوع تنقدر نوصل هيدي الرساله بطريقه تبين انه موضوع طبيعي، هذا منه موضوع بقى انه تعرف نحن ليش we need a spot لانه we have 50% of the society and because we are good in our CVs. لا خلاص بدنا نخلص من هذا الحكي، نحن هذا حق، فبدنا نوصل هيدي الرساله ونغير الثقافه. سوري بس بدي اعطي المجال وبعدين فينا نحكي قد ما بدك، انا موجوده هون. نعم تفضل، كان عندك سؤال؟ How many questions?
Take the last two and then answer them both at the same time.
Okay, thanks.
هلا أنا بس بدي بلش المداخلة، بدي أقول إنه المرأة هي أم المجتمع، هي مش نص المجتمع، هي كل المجتمع. بس أوقات المدافعين عن حقوق المرأة بينتقصوا من قيمتها للمرأة بمحل معين، لما بيعطوها نوع من كوتا بالمجالس أو بالإدارات أو بإدارات الدولة، نوع بيطالبوا لها بكوتا. إنه اليوم مثلا نعتبر مجلس النواب اللبناني يطالب دائما بكوتا نسائية. ليش ما بيكونوا ال 128 نايب نساء؟ وين المشكلة إذا عندهم الكفاءة وقادرين يوصلوا لمجلس النواب؟ وين المشكلة إنه يكونوا ال 128 نائب؟
بدنا 116 سنة حسبناهم نحن، إذا بدنا نكفي على هيدا الترند تنكون 128 مرة بالهيدا، فسيبك من هيدا الديبيت لأنه فينا نحكي ساعتين عن هيدا الموضوع، وآخر شيء رح نوصل سوا على نتيجة إنه لابد من الكوتا. نعم سوري بدي لأنه ما بقى في وقت. وبعدين سيبك من أم المجتمع وأم، خلص نحن في نساء ما بدهم أمهات، ما بدهم يكونوا أمهات.
خذ عنه.
يعني ايه بس يعني كاعلاميين واعلاميات بقى الام هي الاخت والابن والهيدي يعني كثير نبتعد عنها لانه صارت كثير صعبه واحد يبلعها.
بس لانه انفهمت غلط، انا ما عم اقول انه هي ام المجتمع لانه هي ام. انا ما قصدي هيك، انا اللي بقصده انه المراه هي عنصر اساسي فاعل بالمجتمع. انا اذا بدك تقول هالمصطلح انه ام المجتمع بما معنى انه هي شيء اساسي بالمجتمع، صح. مش انه والله هي نص المجتمع، هي كل المجتمع.
Karma, there's two more questions. Let's just take the two final questions and then answer them both at the same time.
هون وهون. تفضل.
أنا كنت بس بدي أسأل سؤال إلك، إنه قديش أنتم بتواجهوا كسيدات تيار مضاد من نفس جنس النساء لمحاربة تقدمكم أو أخذ حقوقكم اللي رايحة زي ما بنسمع يعني. واثنين انه قديش انه هذا التيار المضاد من النساء هو عم بحجم علاقتكم او بالتشريعات، انه اليوم كل التشريعات بتعطيكم الحق مثلا، لكن لما نيجي بدنا نعطي الحق لها في مكان ما، في تيار مضاد من النساء مثلا بظهر، كيف انتم راح تواجهوه؟ لانه اليوم عندكم تيارين صار، احنا كذكور راح نمنع وصولكم، وفي تيار كمان من جهتكم نسائي عم برفض انه المرأة توصل لأماكن محددة. فاليوم الحمل مضاعف، انتم كيف تاكين هذا الجانب؟ يعني بجوز اليوم بتلاقي عنا هون بالقاعة سيدات ضد وجهة نظر. شكرا.
السلام عليكم. مش نحكي عن التجربة التونسية. احنا في تونس عندنا النظام الانتخابي كمثال، هناك التمييز الإيجابي والتناصف بين المرأة والرجل. هناك التناصف بين المرأة والرجل، المرأة أو المرأة رجل. هذه المقاربة ما تكرسش عملية العدالة والإنصاف، لأنه ممكن فما مجموعة من الذكور يكونوا أفضل من النساء، والعكس صحيح، ممكن تكون مجموعة من النساء أو الإناث أفضل من الذكور. معناتها التمييز الإيجابي اللي تم اعتماده في تونس لا يعطي حق الرجل كذلك حق المرأة.
مداخلة يعني. شكرا. I think they both have interventions. أنا بس بدي أحب أقول إنه التيار المضاد يلي جاي من الذكور لا يقارن إطلاقا بالتيار الجاي من المضاد من جاي من النساء. شكرا.
Thank you, Karma. So my name's Gretchen. I also teach courses here at LAU on media and gender. And so through the next sessions that are sponsored as part of WPS, presented by IFI and FES, we're going to be looking and taking a deep dive into the ways in which critical media literacy analyzes gender in newsrooms. Not just news content, which we're going to talk about today, but also the practices in newsrooms that produce the underrepresentation, misrepresentation, and silencing of diverse genders in terms of peace and security coverage. So if you recall, these workshop sessions in the afternoon, they're not just lectures, they're lectures and activities. So for the next hour, I'm going to introduce you to some concepts. We'll practice with a few of the concepts through discussion, lecture discussion, and activities. And then after the coffee break, we're going to come back for activities putting those concepts into practice, okay? So your role as sitting and listening and waiting patiently to do something in terms of activities is going to happen, I promise to you, okay? So the first session, like I said, we look at news content. The second session will look more at practices in newsroom. And then the third section will look at the possibilities in terms of changing these practices and achieving more equality in peace and security news coverage. So I wanted to just give you an overview of the methodology, which I pretty much just did. I'm not going to go a lot into media literacy because we already did this, but this gives you a sense of what's coming up in the program. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go into details here because most of you read this article from Hawks and Points about media literacy, and we talked about it yesterday in terms of promoting criticality in all aspects, but also mobilizing activism and encouraging media activism. And we can see that intersects well nicely with Jad Melki's Media Literacy of the Press, which is not just to promote criticality in media, but also solve problems here and problems in conflict regions around the world. So when we talk about media literacy and critical media literacy, I know we can come at using that knowledge in many different ways in the media classroom, and I really like the way this chart of domains of analysis is organized. Because media is an interdisciplinary field drawing on many areas of study, it can be a bit murky, like what is media? What do you study? If you happen to be a media studies major, people might ask you this. Well, you can point to them, your domain of analysis. I study problems around production, so everything that goes into producing content. This might even be newsroom practices in terms of hiring. Who are the decision makers? Who are the owners? Okay? So this is problems around production. It's the first area, or the top area. This is not really a hierarchy here, but I'm just pointing to the top of this chart. The middle is the product, or content. And this is another domain of analysis that we use a lot in the media literacy classroom. We think about content, we teach content analysis, we teach alternative ways of making alternative content, so we do that work a lot. I would say we do a little bit of the production work, but not as much. And then kind of the work we do the least, at least in my opinion, in terms of critical media literacy teaching and research, is the audience research, the impact, the reception on users of these media. So these are the three areas. This kind of helps me think about impact. And this is sort of guiding the approach to these sessions. We will have a session looking at content today. We'll be followed by a session looking at production practices. And then we'll also think about your own experiences as audiences. And so in order to start our thinking about gender, I think we need to contextualize what we mean by gender in this region and how we think and should be thinking about gender in this region. So I want to point to LAU alumni who's based at Rutgers University, Maya Mikdashi. Her piece, if you open this up, this is the first activity. Remember I said it's not all lectures, you're not just listening, you have to do stuff. And so this first activity is you need to read these 10 points. They're very brief. You can sit with someone if you need help reading these brief 10 points in English, but they're 10 points. And we're going to do a go around on these points with this question. Which points do you agree with or disagree with or want to know more about and why? Okay? So we'll hear from a few of you. You have a few minutes to read the article. Is the link working for everybody? Is anyone having an issue to open the link? Everybody's good? Okay, it's 10 brief points. You have a few minutes. Any questions about what I asked you to do? Okay, read the brief 10 points, and then we're going to talk about this question after. If you're having trouble with the link or accessing the content, Sally and Farah are here. If you raise your hand, oh, Perla's here too. I was thinking you needed help, Perla. If you need help comprehending it too, they're also here of assistance. So just wave your hands if you need any assistance, okay? I'll give you another minute. So Sally and Wissam have microphones. One is going to stand on one side of the room, and the other is going to stand on the other side of the room, and we're going to have a discussion about these 10 points. I know I said I wanted to hear which ones you agree with, disagree with, and which ones you want to know more about or why, but I would like us all to start with number 1. I think number 1 is essential for anyone who approaches the study of gender. Who can tell me the main points of the first item she mentions? Who would like to summarize what it means, the main point of number 1?
Someone.
Sure.
أعتقد حسب ما فهمت السؤال والمكتوب أيضا أن هناك عند دراسة النوع الاجتماعي أو الحياة الجنسية يجب أن يؤخذ بعين الاعتبار طبيعة المجتمعات سواء شرق أوسط أو مجتمع إسلامي أو ما إلى ذلك. يعني يجب أن يكون في أتفق مع أنه يكون دراسة مثل هذه المواضيع مع مراعاة المجتمع بالتدريج حتى يستطيع المجتمع أن يتقبل مثل هذه المصطلحات اللي بدأت تظهر على الساحة في الدراسات الحالة النوع الاجتماعي.
So when studying gender in this region or anywhere in the world, it's important to remember that yes, gender is a construction, and I would say like race. So people are racialized. We're not born raced. In fact, we have one human species. And race is something that is constructed over time. So it's not to say that race and racism are not real lived experiences being felt, conducted, used to suppress, oppress people in this world, or used as identities, if we want to think about it in a positive way. Those are all very much real, but it's a fact that race doesn't exist in biology. You can't biologically distinguish races. Gender, similarly, is a construction. And if we want to think about biologically, we still have to think on a spectrum, because there is no gender binary of male and female. There's actually a spectrum in between as well. Physically, physiologically, biologically, in terms of sex or sex category. But when we think of gender, it doesn't exactly equate sex or sex category. These are separate things. One is biological, and according to Maya Mikdashi, gender is sociological. It's a social construction. What's also important from this, these points, and I do believe it's raised in point 1, where she talks about how gender changes over time in cultures. And that's true in this region as well. There's really great work that Najman Badi has done. Women with mustaches, men without beards. Have you seen this book? It's available, you can get the whole PDF online. Where she talks about the gender construction in Iran and sexuality and how it changed over time with contact in European colonialism. And that is true for European colonialism, went around the world and also imposed certain ideas about gender, in addition to their civilized hypocrisy, if we want to think about Amr's work from earlier, right? In terms of their noble hierarchies, right? And we'll get more into this later on. But the fact is that gender is a construction and it changes over time and culture, and even in this region it has changed over time and culture. Are there any points that you want to agree, disagree, or know more about from Mikdashi? We're going to get through this article pretty quickly. So if you do have something you want to say, just raise your hand and say it now, because we're going to move on. We're good? Okay. It's a good resource. I hope you use it in your teaching and in your classes. So I want to spend the rest of the session, and I promise you will have coffee, hopefully by 3:30. But before we end, I want you to get a sense of how gender is looked at in terms of news content. What are the ways in which, in a media literacy classroom, we can think about gender and news content? So here we have the common ways in which researchers look at gender in news. Some of what is discussed focuses on traits. And so these are the kind of stereotypical images we see of women in news. And this thing of traits isn't just about thinking about women's representation. We can also think about men's representation, or the representation of queer people, or the representation of other social minorities. But because we're focusing on mainstreaming women and the peace and security agenda, we're going to talk mostly about women. So in this case of traits, what are the stereotypical images we see of women in media, in the news? You don't have to have a microphone for this. We don't need to amplify stereotypes, but tell me, what are you seeing in terms of Arabic media, Arabic news coverage? What are the stereotypical traits, the personalities, the kinds of relationships, the kinds of emotions ascribed to women? Anybody want to shout something out? Women are considered emotional. Yeah. They're supposed to be quiet too, so my screaming yesterday was like completely out of order, so, right? So emotional, anybody else? Yes?
Women can't drive.
Can't drive, yes. That's played up in a lot of commercials we see on TV, right? Wear the hijab, yes. Only, 15-20% of the Muslim population lives in MENA, and not everybody, Sorry?
You're supposed to listen quietly to mansplaining?
Yeah. Listen quietly and be quiet. I forgot. Listen and be quiet. Yes? You wanted to add something? No? Okay. Yes?
Women are
Caregivers, yes. So women are caregivers, but they're also to be protected usually by men as well. So there's that relationship. Yes? Dependent, yeah. So in terms of the relationship to caregiving, so women give care, they're also provided for, cared for, and protected, right?
some interviews, for example, animations like this or something, they ask women about how they're preparing their house.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things and stuff that are not just fiction.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next point. So these were traits, more in terms of the emotions ascribed to women, the personalities. It could even be something like the hair. Women are supposed to have long hair according to gender stereotypes. So what this is, I don't know where it fits. But anyway, so sources, who appears in news stories and what occupations are they ascribed? Comes to the point that you were making about being responsible for the household during holidays. So looking at who the source of news is very important. Some of you are working journalists. So for people who are not working journalists, why is the source important to a news story? What do I mean by source? Does anybody have a definition of that? Why is this important, the source? The credibility of the story, who is quoted, the point of view, and sometimes who the story was given by, the source of the story, right? Not just the quotes in the story. So this is what gives so much importance and weight to the source. And so if women are not sourced, if they're not being quoted, if their stories are not the origin of the point of view of a story, then yes, we can see some lack of representation, some misrepresentation that happens. Or if they are quoted, or women ever quoted as officials or experts, not very often, but they are. And so that also begs the question about the issue of being quoted as a mother. How often do we see men quoted as fathers? More often women are quoted as mothers. So you can see traits and sources, those are two ways. A third way is their news role. So what do I mean by news role? So this is, again, coming back to sort of the source, but what's the role of that person? Are they an expert? Are they affiliated with any kind of organization or entity? Are they representing something? So this is what news role means. And again, depending on your role in the news, if you're an eyewitness or an expert, then you have more authority in terms of the credibility, correct? Whereas if you weren't there, but you're somehow related to the story, you might have less credibility. So who's quoted in what role is important. And so what we can see whenever we look to media from the region, and I'll give this case from Palestine, that was research that was conducted in 2018, so not too long ago, by a women's organization there, using the same framework of mainstreaming gender in women, peace and security news. And so with their framework, this framework, they were able to document exactly who is represented in the news. And so the first graph that you see there, we have around only 10%, it says 10 to 12% women representation in news in Palestine. This is women on camera as a character of the news. Just barely over 10%. And all the rest are men. Now, are there 10% women in Palestine? No. Over 50%, just like the rest of the world. Just over 50%. And then here we can see the function of news by sex. So in my Ekmekji's analysis, it should say function of news by gender, but we'll go with Tam's heading here. So they talk about women and men, and they identify the function. So what function did they play? What was their news role, as we talked about before? So here we see spokesperson, women's blue, barely any. Expert or commentator, same, barely any women. Personal experience. This is where women have a role, but they don't have that credibility that one of you mentioned before because they're not an expert, they're not a spokesperson for an organization. They're talking about their personal experience. Eyewitness, a few more than what we see here, but still much less than men. And then we have eyewitness again, but that's mislabeled, and I don't know why. I should ask the colleagues to find out from TAM what they mean. So the point is that women are underrepresented in the news, and the research is being done to document this, and they have made some suggestions, including offering trainings in the Women, Peace and Security agenda for journalism, working in newsrooms, so much like this training that we're doing today. Focusing on editorial policies that call for more equity for underrepresented groups in the media. We can think of very different marginalized groups and how they need more media representation, but for sure we can have more women as spokespersons or experts as a solution. And like I said, training. Now I want to talk about a case study from Afghanistan, which is a little bit outside the MENA region in Central Asia. But in terms of coverage, this past September, what happened in Afghanistan? September 11th, 2021. The Americans withdrew. Well, most of them, they still have their mercenaries. But most Americans withdrew, okay? And in withdrawing, all of a sudden we saw the headlines proclaim again, what about the women? What about the women? And what happened whenever America bombed and occupied Afghanistan? Research shows that prior to the war, there was very little coverage about women in Afghanistan, even though the United States was fully aware of problems in Afghanistan for women. But all of a sudden, the US occupied, and that occupation included Barbara Bush, who was then First Lady. Sorry, I was trying to think of the term, vice woman president. I don't know where I was going with that, but anyway, the First Lady, she made an address where she appealed that we needed to bomb Afghanistan to save the women. This concept of bombing for democracy, this concept particularly of bombing for women, is called Imperialist Feminism. It's really important to understand that there is not one kind of feminism. And when people use language of women's empowerment to bomb and actually bring more harm, destruction, starvation, and crisis for women, that is an example of imperialist feminism. So that's one concept I want you to keep in your mind in terms of a discourse that exists in the news. So before we go on to other forms of discourse, I want to ask anyone here on the mic to define discourse. What do I mean by discourse? Don't Google it. I will cut off the Wi-Fi if I hear any Google definitions. Just give a guess. Narratives? Okay. Anybody else? Discourse. Points of view. Interesting. Different point of view. Context. Discussion. Okay. Yes? Say it again. All that is written? Oral and written discourse, right? I thought we were getting poetic here. All that is written is discourse. So you're referring to the production processes, right? But the impact of discourse is what I want to focus on. And discourse in media has the power to construct others. It has power. It shows us power relations. So when I talk about imperialist feminism as a discourse, there are certain people who benefit from that discourse. I've empowered women with these bombs. I'm good at going to war, right? I say that as an American, okay? But then there are also other people who do not benefit from the discourse of imperialist feminism. And so that power relationship is what we're trying to spot. When you think about discourse, look for power. And so in the critical media studies classroom, we need to be thinking about discourses, because even if we bring spokespersons up in the blue there from 9% to 50-50, men and women, if all of those men and women are calling to bomb Afghanistan to liberate the women, we don't need to have the news media dominated by imperialist feminism. We need other voices, voices of peace, voices of anti-imperialism. So it's very conscious to remember that whenever we're trying to create a more equitable newsroom, we're not just trying to bring in more women, as was mentioned in the video from Karma, because some of those women might just be speaking the tune of the powerful. They might just be pushing that agenda and using their gender to legitimize the same problem. So we have to be very conscious about when we're inviting any gender, any marginalized group to come and speak, what are we upholding? Are we upholding the powerful, or are we giving voice to the powerless? It's an important question to ask, and discourse helps us think about that. There's a couple of other discourses I want to bring up, and I would argue that imperialist feminism and this other one I'll talk about in a second is related to Orientalism. Now, when we talk about Orientalism, we have to mention Edward Said, and I would ask anyone here to just remind everyone, what is Orientalism? What was Edward Said writing many books and producing much knowledge about when he was talking about Orientalism? Anybody? Sorry, let's go to the front and then there.
Yes. We talk about orientation a lot. He's a Palestinian origin. And
Closer, Kari.
okay. We talk about orientation, and he's a Palestinian, and he have many situations that support this point of view.
Thank you for that. We're gonna go here and then here. Orientalism. So he did spot it in many different places, in many different ways. He actually looked at the whole cultural history of production in Europe, as you mentioned. And even, as I mentioned earlier today, he wrote stories about cultural imperium, looking even at the cultural archive of the United States. And so his work expanded over his time. Yes?
Okay, so you want me to tell you what's Orientalism?
What is Orientalism? Yeah.
Orientalism is when Western go off into the regions that are in the East, like the Middle East or China, and study the region from his perspective as an Orientalist there.
Yeah, it's a field of study, right? That's where he got the term Orientalism, is because Oriental studies is a thing and still a thing. Did you want to add something here?
It is the framing of the Middle East as an exotic place
I mean, many people give the example of Aladdin movie of the Disney, which is
horrible. Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that. I just want to move on and clarify too that you're all talking about similar things. And I want to come back to what I said earlier about discourse. Discourse is about power. So when we look at Orientalism, we can ask, who has the power to represent and who does not have the power to represent? So of course, we have our own cultural production industries here, but they're not nearly as popular in America as Aladdin or Disney, right? Most Americans are not tuning into pan-Arab stations. They're not watching Arab movies, although there are increasingly some on Netflix, but as we saw from Adib, there's a lot of Zionist content on Netflix too. So who has the power to represent is one of the main points of Orientalism that we need to think about, because again, discourse is about power, and whenever the West has the power to represent the East, but the East doesn't have the power to represent itself here or to the West, that's a problem. So that's why it's important to think about that in terms of a discourse. The last one I want to mention in terms of Afghanistan is thinking about a concept. Again, all of this is from scholarship. I have references. I know I sound like I've done amazing work, but I'm just quoting research. This is reading. This is mobilizing content in the media literacy classroom. So another research that, another point, another discourse that comes from these researchers working on media coverage of Afghanistan is the discourse of the protection scenario. The protection scenario. What do you think is meant by the protection scenario when it comes to news coverage in Afghanistan? Protection scenario.
I would directly think of how to use women to justify certain actions, and the protection scenario then is to claim these women need our protection, so we need to save them from the evil men in this country, which,
we're going to come here too, and then we'll move on. Yeah. Thank you everyone for helping with the mic.
I will just add something to what you said. It's a reason that they can use for international intervention in another way. Yeah. First, it was war. And then, armed operations. Now, we are making peace, we're bringing peace in another form.
Yes. So I think this is a great point too about foreign intervention coverage. And so when we come together in the afternoon, when we come together after coffee, we're gonna do analysis together. And we're gonna practice using some of these concepts of news coverage. And it's important to understand that whenever we're watching news coverage in this region of foreign intervention, sometimes these discourses get reproduced. Sometimes in Arab-produced media, but sometimes in media produced in Arabic, but by BBC or Sky News. Okay, so it's very important to watch these discourses. And again, try to spot the power relationship. Did you want to add something?
No, I just want to add that they use the girl.
Yeah.
And lately, last year, I think they find it. She's different.
Yeah. So I want to come to Bibi now. So I have a picture of Bibi Ashi. I just want to offer a bit of a trigger warning. She's been physically maimed, but since then she's had surgery, so things are fine. But how did the U.S. use this violence that was committed against her? How was it used? So something that's terrible, that's awful, was used to justify the intervention. But more than that, it was used to convince the world, and mostly Americans, that they should stay. That's why we only talked about the withdrawal happening last fall and not before. So here's Bibi. She's on the cover of Time magazine. This is sold across the United States and in airports around the world. And it says, what happens if we leave Afghanistan? In small print here, it says, Aisha Bibi, 18, had her nose and ears cut off last year on orders from the Taliban because she left her abusive in-laws. And again, the main title is What Happens If We Leave Afghanistan. Do you see Orientalist discourses here? Do you see the protection scenario? Do you see imperialist feminism? Do they use those words? Or the words Orientalism there? Protection scenario is not there. Neither is imperialist feminism. But we can spot the power, correct? This is the discourse. So discourse is not the same as linguistics. It's not wording. It's about what's not there. Okay? So this is the kind of work we're going to have you do after the coffee break, looking at news features in Arabic. And when you go to the coffee break, if you're not fluent in Arabic or you're worried about your contribution or your comprehension of these news pieces, then be sure that when you come back to the room and you work together in groups, that your groups are mixed. Arabic speakers with non-Arabic speakers. So you can arrange that at coffee break. So I think a lot of this, especially this image, reminds us again of the civilized hypocrisy that Amir Zahir talked about earlier today in the presentation that I did this morning. But we have to remember that all of this coverage of Afghanistan, that Stable and Kumar, the authors that I'm quoting here, researched and produced this research back in 2005 based on what was happening in the news in 2003 during the occupation, war, and intervention in Afghanistan. This same coverage happened again last fall. And I'm sure if Stable and Kumar did the same study, they would find the same protection scenario. They would find the same discourses of Orientalism and imperialist feminism. So I want to go to one more location in this case study review, and that is in Jordan, of Syrian refugees. Now, I was in Jordan doing research for my own PhD at the time that this research was produced by Al Hayek. She actually was a roommate of mine, and she was going to Zaatari camp. And she was trying, and she's Syrian herself, and she was trying to find out what's happening with the Syrian refugees, because in the West there are tons of news coverage, news stories about Syrian women, refugees specifically in Jordan. And she said that the main concern in the news, and she talks about this in her article titled Double Marginalization, is that women were framed, or the discourses told about them were that they needed saving because their children were being married off. They were in such terrible conditions in the camps, the only way for them to leave was to marry off children. And so when she went to the camps, what she actually heard from the women is that, when she interviewed them herself, was that they wanted to live without fear. They were in the camps where at any moment they could catch fire. They were in the camps, which winter in Jordan is cold and rainy, do not go. They would flood. I'm sorry if you're Jordanian and you love the winter. Some people do. Some people love winter, okay? But after 15 years in Canada, I can't say that I like winter anymore. Anyway, so the point is, Zaatari camp would flood every winter because it doesn't have that infrastructure. Most camps don't have that infrastructure to deal with the rains. So the fires, the rains, the stampedes of supply distribution actually killed and harmed more women and children than the issue of child marriage. And when she went to interview the campaigns, people who were speaking to the media on behalf of these women, the campaigners were saying, yes, the issue is child marriage, the issue is child marriage, and she couldn't figure out, well, what's the difference? Why is this happening? Why are the women telling me one thing, and then the spokespersons, right, the news role as we talked about before, the spokespersons are saying something else. And so what she found out was that there's this issue of self-Orientalism that is happening. These campaigns that are then spokespeople in the media are self-orientalizing for Western media. They're framing the agenda to fit the narrative that the West is coming with. And she calls that a process of self-Orientalism. Now, it's not her scholarship she's mobilizing on scholarship on this topic, but she found that it works in this case because a lot of campaigns for Syrian refugees in Jordan were funded by Western donors. And while that funding can be useful, sometimes it can influence in negative ways as well. And what she found is it was influencing how the spokespeople were organizing the campaigns, the kind of branding they were putting on it, and how they were talking about and for these women, and not providing them an opportunity to speak for themselves. So on the one hand, that is why she talks about self-orientalization. It's because of what the campaigns were doing in the media. Now these were campaigns sometimes run by Syrians, sometimes run by Jordanians, but for, not by, for Syrian refugee women. And then on the other hand, what Syrian women were actually telling her and what they would have told the media had they actually interviewed them and given them that news role of being an expert on their own life. So she referred to that experience, the experience of these women, as a kind of double marginalization. They don't have access to the Western media. They don't have the English, they're not being interviewed. They also don't have access to the Western funding, so they don't have their own campaigns. Everything has to go through these campaign organizers. And they don't, in the camp, have access to the internet. So this Refugees Not Captives Facebook campaign, they've never even seen it, although it was organized to supposedly act on their behalf. And lots of money flowing in to these kinds of campaigns, which, again, for the women that were spoken to by Cathy, they were not benefited by. So it's important to think about these case studies because they offer us ways to think about the media critically, news media. So we have the ways in which critical media scholars study gender, looking at gender stereotypes in terms of traits, what's the news role, who's the news sources. But then we also have discourses by researchers working in this region or researching media about this region that also are useful. So before we go to the break, I want to hear questions. If anyone has questions about what these are, because when you come back from the break, you will be asked to use these concepts. And so if some of them are not clear, you have to ask now, so we can clear them up, so that you understand what they are and can apply them when we come back to your news analysis. So questions for clarification? Yeah. Sure. Karma has a story. She wants to share what you think of your questions. Any questions at this moment?
So I was once at a mediation training session, and there were men and women, so it wasn't only for women. And the group was divided into two groups. So there were two groups, and we were doing a simulation of a conflict zone. So how to resolve a conflict. And the story is actually one where I was sitting and watching a conversation between two people. One is a giant in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, Sanam Narangi Anderlini, who was one of the people who actually helped draft the 1325, the Security Council resolution, and another man from actually a foreign ministry of one of the European countries. And we were debating, why women in this particular scenario, why women in real life are not involved in the negotiations and the peacemaking. And so the man said, look, don't take this the wrong way. I mean, this is not my opinion, but women are regarded as being too emotional. It's regarded as, will you be able to put your emotions aside when dealing with such issues such as war and peace? And so my friend looks at him and says, you're right, because these men shooting at each other, they're very rational. They're not emotional at all. So he paused for a moment and said, can you imagine how emotional one should be to be able to behave this way, to kill others, to shoot, to put bombs? I mean, that is the furthest you can be from being rational. So enough with these emotional arguments, because you really have to be emotional to go into an armed conflict. So I want you to keep this story in mind.
Thank you. Other questions? Clarifications? People want coffee, I can see. Huh? It's that 2-hour mark. I appreciate it. Thank you for staying with us for the concepts. Do come back on time because we're actually getting you on schedule. I know there's been many threats from Jad. We're going to stay 30 minutes later, but I'm not going to stay if we get done on time. So that means go have your coffee efficiently. Don't forget I asked you to organize by linguistic groups. If you're a non-Arabic speaking, during the coffee break, meet some Arabic speakers so you can do the activity when you come back. Thank you.